Hello, everybody, and welcome. I have returned to you with a return, shall we say, to business as usual. And we are coming to you today with a live stream appropriately entitled Blame It on Putin. And I will begin with a poetry reading tonight because I think this is appropriate, and it goes to, well, to speak about the subject which we will be, shall we say, explaining and digressing upon in the next hour or so. So I'll begin with the reading of a short poem called Antagonish by Hughes Mearns. Poem goes as follows. Yesterday upon the stair I met a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. I wish he'd go away. When I came home last night at 3, the man was waiting there for me. But when I looked around the hall, I couldn't see him there at all. Go away, don't you come back any more. Go away, and please don't slam the door. Last night I saw upon the stair a little man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. Oh, how I wish he'd go away. And that I have chosen because I think that adequately sums up what is going to be the subject of discussion this evening, or the principal subject of discussion, I should say, which is the image of Putin. The image of Putin in the West, which is Putin as the puppet master, as the grand spy master, as the man who sits in the Kremlin playing chess with the West, moving his various agents across the board like pawns, seeking to trap various presidents and prime ministers into a checkmate situation, to use or perhaps exhaust the Russia and chess analogies there. But this image of Putin has popped up with wearisome regularity, really over the last 20 to 25 years, certainly since about 2002 to 2003. And in response to an email I got off one particular listener, I thought it would be worth exploring tonight, because he was, of course, blamed again, Putin was, for the recent riots in the in Britain, in perfidious Albion itself, and blamed upon some incredibly flimsy premises. And he was blamed for Brexit, again, by some very shady characters, such as the disgraced alleged journalist Carol Cadwallader, and also by even more disgraceful characters like Luke Harding. And it seems that every time that something goes wrong in Britain or the United States, the figure, not the reality of Putin, the figure, the fiction of Putin, pops up into the press. Now, let's start then by looking at the development of this paranoia. And let's start off by acknowledging some basic truths. Some basic truths are that every single nation in the world, particularly the imperialist nations, and also the targets of their actions, so Russia and China, etc., the DPRK, all of these nations employ the services of intelligence professionals. That is something which should barely even need to be said. Now, the nature of the intelligence services in each country varies. Of course, the imperialist countries have some of the most extensive foreign intelligence operations in the world. Britain, in many respects, the imperialists here pioneered this. They really blazed a trail for the development of intelligence services, not just in terms of the direct employees of the SIS or MI6, the external intelligence services, or MI5, the internal secret police, basically. The British pioneered this because they were able to really integrate various different professions into the broader spectrum of intelligence, as we've discussed many times before: journalism, NGO service, etc. Other seemingly innocent professions which people hold on a genuine basis, but which, of course, are combined with intelligence actions. So Russia employs the services of a multitude of intelligence agencies, as did the Soviet Union before it. And this is something that we should acknowledge. The Russian Federation engages in espionage in the countries which are principally targeting it. So Britain and the United States. The United States in particular, I think. I think also there will be a strong Russian intelligence presence, or would have been, in Germany, maybe in France as well. So these nations all spy on each other. So the intelligence game is well understood by those who play it, and it is something which has gone on for a very long time. And so that is the first acknowledgement to make. The Russians do employ the services of people in the intelligence business, and they are apparently very good at it. Now, Putin himself, of course, had a career before he went into politics as a intelligence professional within the KGB. In fact, he was based in the DDR, the old DDR. And so this has added to the image of Putin. Again, the reality of Putin and the image of Putin in the bourgeois press are two different things. So that's added to the ability of the bourgeois press in Britain to explain everything as a fiendish plot by the old spy master sitting in the Kremlin. So that's one thing. And that, again, some of these myths come out of realities, and it's important to say that. So the reality that every nation in the world has an intelligence service, and most of the nations of the world have foreign intelligence services, and the biggest nations in the world all spy on each other. We know for a fact that the US spies on absolutely everybody, including its supposed allies. So there is that truth to say, first of all. There is also a certain truth in that the Russians, as does every single major power in the world, seeks to, shall we say, stick the knife in and twist it when there's a wound in their opponent. So when Brexit happened, or when the British went through several different prime ministers in a couple of years, when Boris Johnson oversaw a disastrous failure of a government, when Liz Truss resigned after less than a month or so in power, when the Rishi Sunak disastrously collapsed to an election defeat, when the recent riots happened, the Russian media, Russian state-run media, will twist the knife in a wound. Of course they will. Britain has, or the British ruling class, have openly declared themselves to be the bitter enemies of the Russian Federation. So when your bitter enemy is going through internal difficulties, you, through your official propaganda networks, will, again, as I said, stick the knife into the wound and twist it. Again, the British do this all the time to the Russians. Why wouldn't the Russians pay them back in their own coin? So that's another certain truth to be acknowledged. So these are two elements of the stories about Putin the puppet master, which are, which contain elements of truth. Like Russia does run a very professional overseas intelligence service, which is widely respected even amongst its enemies, and of course has its roots in the spycraft of the old Soviet Union, and also that Russia's official media operations will seek to elevate negative narratives about their official enemies. These are two things which are true. So now we've got that out of the way, let's go from things that are true to the man who is not there, which is, of course, the image of Putin, which is portrayed in the British bourgeois press and the American bourgeois press, and the fact that this is not a real thing, which they are talking about. So what is the image of Putin? The image of Putin, as I indicated in my introduction, is of a shadowy puppet master, a man who, by pulling strings, can control the politics of Britain. If you believe the official story, then the official government and media and intelligence services of Britain and the United States have been powerless to prevent this incredibly, apparently omnipotent figure in the Kremlin from imposing upon the United States, an unwilling United States, one president in Donald Trump, imposing upon Britain the referendum result of 2016, which caused us to leave the European Union, or caused us to be seen to be voting to leave the European Union. Apparently, if that was Putin's fault, he did that, and all of the media and political class and intelligence services and law enforcement agencies of this country were powerless to prevent him. He's that good. other things that Putin has, of course, been blamed for. He's been blamed for, of course, coming up with all of the policies of Donald Trump. He's been blamed, of course, for Jeremy Corbyn and Nigel Farage. He's been blamed for stirring up the problems with regard to the riots. Now, you might say, if you're watching this channel, there's a fair chance you're of a Marxist-Leninist persuasion, or at least of an anti-imperialist persuasion. But even if you're not, you must look at this and think that this narrative is rubbish, because what the people who are telling you that Putin has been behind Trump, been behind Brexit, been behind the recent riots, and a whole load of other things, it must occur to you as an intelligent and thinking person that if these intelligence agencies, police agencies, media agencies, government figures are all telling you that essentially they are impotent, that's their message. That before the mighty Putin, the spy master, in his lair in the Kremlin or in a deep nuclear bunker underneath it, that they are powerless before him. That by the mere movement of some of his pawns, he can defeat all of these agencies of the imperialist West. Now, that's a remarkable way of making propaganda, to basically admit that you and all of these agencies, which you spend hundreds of billions on every year, if we total up the budget of the NATO countries on military, intelligence, law enforcement, and media propaganda work, what they are saying is that all of this pales into comparison next to the sheer power of the man in the Kremlin. Again, it's a remarkable piece of propaganda. You are saying essentially that all of your state forces are completely useless, completely impotent. They can't stop anything that the Russians are doing. So therefore, ergo, the response is to give them more power. All these institutions which have failed to stop, apparently, the diabolical genius in the Kremlin, should be given more power. So what? They can fail harder and spend more money. When you start to pull at the threads here, the narrative starts to look completely ridiculous. So let's then move on to say, okay, so this argument, it looks ridiculous on the face of it, because again, like how on earth could it be the case that if we take the narrative at face value with regard to, say, Trump, how can it be the case that the Russians can elect a president of the United States? How could it be without stuffing the ballot boxes themselves? And the arguments made about the Russians installing Trump were always ridiculous. They didn't even go as far as saying that there was some guy in a bearskin hat stuffing ballot boxes in Michigan or something in 2016 for Trump. They were arguing that the Russians rigged it by putting out Buff Bernie memes. Remember those? Bernie Sanders on Arnold Schwarzenegger's body in a pair of Speedos or something like that. That was what inspired people to not vote for Hillary Clinton. Or, putting out memes about, Jesus says vote for Trump and stuff like that. And that was what won it. So their arguments weren't even particularly serious. They weren't even particularly well put together. They were basically, it was like the propaganda of out of touch, with the risk of being generationalist here, very out of touch boomers. That seemed to be the target market for this, who would be blinded by internet speak. There's Rachel Maddow crying on MSNBC saying, Vladimir Putin put out some very damaging memes. And that's what caused Hillary Clinton to lose. A transparently foolish and ridiculous argument that never was remotely serious. And then the arguments that they made later on that Trump was somehow under the control of Putin. Again, you examined it in any serious way. And this is where you have to give someone like Aaron Mate credit, because he did, and Michael Tracy, to be fair, because both of them did seek out interviews with the people concerned and actually went on the programs of people making these allegations. And people like Sam Cedar, if you go and look at the interview that Michael Tracy did with Sam Cedar, where Cedar's bellowing and screaming at him, because of course Cedar has no argument when it comes to the actual allegations of Russiagate. Or you look at when Mate questioned the idiot Luke Harding, the propagandist Luke Harding, and Harding's arguments fell apart within seconds, because he just didn't, again, exposed to the mildest degree of questioning, these things fall to pieces, because it just doesn't make any sense. The fact is, though, that these arguments were never meant to be taken seriously or questioned. They were meant to be just absorbed by a passive population, absorbed and believed without ever being examined. And here's an interesting anecdote for you from my own experiences. I was on the bus, it was a couple of years ago now, it was just after the launch of the special military operation. And I heard some guys saying on the back of this bus, because I was on it for quite some time, talking about, oh, Putin, I heard he's dying. I heard he's dying. I heard he's been dying for years. I heard he's got 5 different forms of cancer and dementia, and like he's doing this to be, you know, to have one final bang before the end. And to believe that, you have to never examine it. And if you understand what I mean here, to absorb something that ridiculous, to think that there's any system in the world, any system, any governmental system, would be subjected purely to the whim of a crazed, dying man who has decided that in some sort of, I don't know, to go out in some sort of typically Freudian excess, you know, to become the literal embodiment of the death drive on his way out of the world, and that's why he started a war. And I don't particularly blame these guys for repeating this shit. This is like, you know, the bullshit that the bourgeoisie and their press pours into people's heads, so it shouldn't be a surprise is that it comes undiluted out of people's mouths. But that's the kind of arguments that they put out there, that it's ridiculous, but they hammer it and hammer it and hammer it until it becomes just a point of conversation that is never challenged. Because if you challenge that, and you could challenge that by quite easily by saying, well, even in your everyday working life, like, is it really the case that if some manager, even a manager who has total power over you in the workplace, started doing things that were completely fucking insane because he was dying and wanted to go out in a blaze of bitterness, that nobody would pick up on that nobody would challenge that? They're not even like people on the same level as this guy would, and there are people almost on the same level as Putin in the Russian system, as we've outlined many times before, that even like on a workplace level, that wouldn't be challenged, that wouldn't be picked up on, that wouldn't be stopped if it was damaging to the wider organization. Of course it would be. Like, again, like, to believe this about Putin, about the Russian Federation, you have to have not only no knowledge of the Russian Federation, but also you have to actually, it can never ever be challenged. This sort of memes that the ruling class hammers into people's heads, it can never be subject to any criticism, which is why no criticism is allowed. So the arguments they make are transparent nonsense and fall apart under even a mild examination. They fall apart, which is why no mild examination of them is ever allowed. And so here we get to what I think is the crux here of the system that is in place. A system of hysterical propaganda around which circles around, I should say, the figure of Putin, the fictional figure of Putin. So where does this all begin? I would posit that it begins really at least as early as 2002, because as early as 2002, a couple of crucial things happen. First of all, with regard specifically to the relationship between the imperialist powers and Russia, first of all, it becomes clear that the Putin system, and again, we should always emphasize, Putin is a skilled politician who is a very effective chairman of various committees, a mediator between various different factions. But he is not a dictator. And again, classical dictatorships, the idea of one-man rule, are largely mythological. Like, no system has ever been one-man rule. Not the absolute monarchies of the feudal period, not the fascist dictatorships, not the various different forms of Bonapartism that have existed. There's no such thing as one-man rule. Let's just get that out of the way straight away. It doesn't exist. It has never existed. It could not exist. Are we really seriously saying that Hitler, who was off his chump on speed half the time, was making all of the decisions in the Third Reich? That doesn't mean that the Third Reich wasn't as appalling and murderous and reactionary as it undoubtedly was. What it means is there's a much wider sense of responsibility to go around than just Hitler, or just Hitler plus Goering and Himmler, or just Hitler, Goering, Himmler, and the other most senior elements of the Nazi Party, like the kind of people who did get hanged after Nuremberg. Like, the actual responsibility for the crimes of Hitlerism goes way further than was ever acknowledged. One-man totalitarianism is a convenient 20th century myth dreamed up by liberals who wanted to boil fascism down to the simplest, most fictional expression of it. The idea of it just being Hitler the bad guy, plus maybe Goering, Himmler, and Goebbels, and it could all be pinned on them. Wider questions could be ignored. You know, it was a bunch of bad men seized control of a nation that had succumbed to a fit of mass hysteria due to economic crisis and communism. You know, you know, they'd also try this with regard to Stalin. And again, some of this actually comes from Trotsky and comes from Khrushchev. The idea that Stalin was doing a one-man rule job in the Soviet Union, transparently ridiculous. You know, you don't even have to be a Marxist. There are even like social democrats and liberal scholars from years before, back in the Cold War, who are anti-Stalin, who have to acknowledge that it was not one-man rule. It never was. Again, such things don't exist, but it's been recreated again to you know, summarize, or should we say reduce, a nation to one man in the form of Putin. And again, like, you examine the system, you can see that it was always based on multiple competing factions, multiple very powerful individuals and groups, some of which were in the early years more powerful than Putin, and through which Putin and an inner circle of people who he particularly trusts, people like Medvedev, like Shoigu, like Patrushev, and a few others from the St. Petersburg circle of the early 90s, all ex-CPSU, by the way. They have been navigating their way through this, building multiple coalitions and multiple consensuses to slowly take Russia forward. And again, this has had backward and forward motions. This, at various different motions, has been more liberal. It has then become more statist. It has been influenced by Western thought in its very earliest phases. It then started to take an Eastern turn particularly after 2003 to 4, and certainly after 2008. And increasingly in recent years, it has come to be influenced by the ideas of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. The point about this rather long digression is reducing it to the figure of Putin is nonsense. Again, like, this is like classic 20th century propaganda that was really born out of anti-communism, and it doesn't take too much to dispel it. But again, like, the only reason this works is because no one is there in the bourgeois press to actually put an opposing point of view. An opposing point of view is not allowed. So the hostility towards Putin starts around about 2002 and into 2003. Starts because of two things. First of all, Putin. We're going to use Putin as a shorthand here, because the episode bears his name, and we're talking about the bullshit that surrounds him. But when I'm using Putin, I'm referring to Putin as the collective, as the head of a system, which is what he is, as the man at the heart of a system. But let's use the shorthand of just using his name, because if I have to explain that every single time, we're going to be here until about midnight. So Putin being the shorthand here, and the Russian government start taking measures to do some reining in of those who are referred to as oligarchs, the likes of Berezovsky and others, who had made their money in criminal ways in the 90s, and who hoped that they would be getting a more stable and sober version of Yeltsin. And behind them, of course, stood the imperialists. And now Putin cuts a deal with them early on, and says they can keep all their assets, but essentially they need to stop compromising the integrity of the Russian state. And it's at this point that Putin and the Putin system start to take a progressive Bonapartist turn. And it's from this point, and this is the virtues of actually having been around at the time, I can remember the very earliest phases of Putin, where he was invited on the old David Frost show. If anybody's watching in Britain who remembers that, though of course David Frost had a somewhat transatlantic career. And in the earliest days, 2002, early 2001, and immediately after September the 11th, he was all over the television, giving very friendly interviews. He was grinning and shaking hands with Tony Blair. Tony Blair, who said in a memo that was put out there when it was leaked by WikiLeaks, saying that we have to essentially patronize Russia. We have to make them think that they're a great power, even though they're not, though that really should be said more of Britain than of Russia. So he's all over the place for the first year or two of his presidency in the West, shaking hands, giving speeches in German to the German Bundestag, and of course that's a big priority for the Russian ruling class because that's a big market for energy products, and they hoped to advance in that market, and they did for a while. So very important that relations with Germany were established. It's also very important for the US that their scheme continued. And here we will have to divert into the motivations of the imperialists. The motivations of the imperialists, as I've said many times before, are that they always felt, I think accurately from their point of view, that they didn't finish the job on Russia in the 90s, that there was more to be done to make sure that the counter-revolution went a lot further. See, what happened was the counter-revolution in Russia got so far. Its high point was probably between 1993 and 1998. After 1998, it all went to shit for them because the economic crash then was so disastrous and the policies of Yeltsin were so utterly discredited that even a figure like Primakov, who was brought in to become prime minister, had to get into a coalition with the KPRF to essentially stop the implosion of the Russian economy and the Russian state. Because there are various different theories as to how close the Russian state got to collapse in the late 90s. There was some talk that certain regions were starting to implement their own rules, that there were areas of the country where the writ of the state just simply did not run, not just Chechnya, but other places as well, places like Dagestan, or certainly places within Dagestan. And other areas where mafia clans had essentially staked their claims, where various different cliques were running different parts of the country with barely a nod and a wink towards the central government. And if you're the imperialists and your plan is to make sure that this situation continues or reaches a point where the country breaks up entirely, this is something you very much want to see continue. The Primakov government is probably the point where it stops. And even though Primakov was fired, the damage to Yeltsin had been done. The various different factions inside the Kremlin and in the wider Russian ruling class moved against the open comprador element. And it was the open comprador element that was pushed out bit by bit. They're still there in Russia. I mean, there's still Yeltsin centers in Russia, as the KPRF point out all the time. Those people who reduced Russia to the status of being a semi-colony in the 90s almost, are still active in Russia, but they're very much marginalized now. Their power has drained away. But it was them that lost out in that period, 98 to 2000, and it culminated with Yeltsin's Biden-esque resignation, or I should say that Biden made a Yeltsin-esque resignation, because Yeltsin is drunk, pushed in, or very ill, pushed in front of a camera, says, "I have to go now," and that's it. Then Putin emerges. And Putin, of course, is the consensus figure. He's not the most popular pick. Primakov thought he should get it. And by experience, he certainly should have done. But Putin was the one who was acceptable to all the different factions at the time, or he was the most acceptable, including like the Yeltsin comprador faction. Because remember, he'd done work in the Yeltsin administration in 96 and 97, and he'd been head of the FSB. So he was a known figure even amongst the Yeltsin circle. So again, takes over as the man who is the least offensive to the various different factions. But again, like the moving picture of Russian politics pushes Putin in a certain direction. And that certain direction is to be more and more definite about the enforcement of Russian sovereignty, which is, of course, to come back to the plans of the imperialists, what they very much didn't want. They wanted essentially somebody who would either keep Russia in this sort of perpetually weak state. Remember the very recent comment made by Putin to Modi that the imperialists were basically telling the Russians to get rid of their nuclear power stations and their nuclear weapons in the 90s. They were making offers to entice them to do just that, because if you're not energy independent and you can't generate your own electricity, then you are even more under their power, and that's what they wanted. Now, just by stopping that, didn't even have to be exactly the new Lenin. In fact, Putin in his very early years was very much more anti-communist even than he is now. But even just by stopping the disintegration of the state, vigorously prosecuting the war in Chechnya against what we now know definitively was a Chechen rebellion that had the CIA and MI6 behind it. And by prosecuting that and winning it, despite a long and difficult war, by calming the situation in Chechnya and the Lower Caucasus, though it should be emphasized that in places like Dagestan, it's still pretty wild sometimes. Those CIA and MI6 operations are still running in those parts of the country. But by eliminating the most overt excesses of the Russian mafia, so they're still there. Organized crime is still there, but they have been forced to essentially control themselves. The overt violence and areas of the country being openly under the control of organized crime is something which is not allowed. So much like it is, by the way, in the United States. In the United States, and in Britain too, but let's use the US example. Like organized crime has always been tolerated. It's always had an interesting relationship with the state forces, sometimes a partnership, and very often a partnership. But what's not allowed in the United States, and this is why certain mafia dons are sent to prison or killed, what's not allowed is that you get to essentially declare UDI, Unilateral Declaration of Independence. You don't get to do that in the United States. If you're some sort of mafia chieftain, if you play ball with the state, you're allowed to make your money in whatever heinous way that you choose to, but you don't get to challenge the state authorities. If you do, you die or you get locked up. Same deal in Russia. Like, there's still an organized crime presence, nothing like what it was. There's still people dealing in drugs and weaponry and all kinds of things. But again, similar deal to what the United States has. If you try and infringe upon the authority of the state, if you infringe upon the state's monopoly of political power or the state's monopoly on violence, then that monopoly on violence will take you out, or you'll either end up dead or in prison. So by merely doing that, by merely enforcing the same rules which the United States itself insists upon within its borders, Putin becomes a threat. And that's when the hysteria starts. And the hysteria starts, and of course, it's all literally the former KGB colonel, has done this, this, and this, and violating human rights, etc. And this, I remember, being the headlines pretty regularly from 2002 onwards. After Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the chairman and the owner of Yukos, was rightly imprisoned for things that he had done, such as tax evasion. But really, he was imprisoned because he was going to make a run at the presidency in a very well-funded campaign that would have foreign backing. And that's why he was imprisoned. He was busted for tax evasion that he was manifestly guilty of. But again, when that happened, it became obvious that the figure of Putin and the Russian system that was emerging around him was not going to allow a foreign agent, which is what Khodorkovsky both was and remains, to take over. So the hysteria starts to get whipped up ever more so after that. We see it with increasing in Britain after the mysterious death of Alexander Litvinenko in 2006. And then the hysteria kicks into a new gear after 2008, after the Russians defeat Saakashvili's Georgian forces. Again, remember, the Georgians have admitted recently that the new Georgian government, under the Georgian Dream Party, have admitted recently that the war in South Ossetia was something that was the creation of Mikhail Saakashvili at the instigation of outside parties. Now, you don't need to be a genius to work out who those outside parties are. It's the United States and the British. They're the ones who instigated the war of 2008. And because Saakashvili is a maniac and an idiot, he thought that the US would be sending the 101st Airborne in to save him. That wasn't the case then. It's not the case for Zelensky now. But after that, it becomes incredibly obvious that not only is it the case that even when Putin is in the prime minister's job, the Russian system continues. It continues under Medvedev. But the US plan to try and stop Putin from running again goes all wrong. And he never stood any chance of success because, again, the bargain between Putin and Medvedev was struck a long time before that. It's one that Medvedev was always going to honor. So Putin comes back in 2012, and I think it's fair to say that after that, it's all gloves off. Not that there have been many gloves on before that. Remember, there had been, the British and the Americans had been sponsoring a war in the Caucasus. They'd sponsored terrorist attacks inside Russia. They'd orchestrated a coup in Ukraine in 2004 for the specific purpose of doing what was eventually done 10 years later, which is instigating a civil war, which was going to be done for the specific purpose of causing a crisis inside Russia itself. That's what the Ukraine game has always been about. So why do we get to the point where we have the Putin puppet master stories? Well, that should be clear by now. It's principally because every single government in the modern era, in fact, even in the pre-modern era, has needed, especially in these times, an external villain to pin everything on. And this is particularly so in late-stage imperialism, when the ruling class has no interest or ability to actually solve any of the problems that are growing inside American or British society. So you just say it's all a plot by somebody else. You say it's all misinformation. Now, remember, the big word in the last 8 to 9 years has been misinformation. And this really took off, I think, after 2016. Because before that, up to 2015-16, up to the point where Trump emerges and the point where Corbyn and then Brexit emerge as political developments. Before that, the ruling class, and I think they'd conned themselves that they'd ridden out the 2008 crisis. They told themselves that they'd sorted everything out, that they'd overcome things. They hadn't. They were kidding themselves that they had. But finally, the effects of the 2008 crises and the longer crises manifest themselves politically within their system in a way they can't ignore. Now, Trump, I will maintain, was never a serious threat to anything. We're coming back to Trump in a later live stream in the coming week, and my thesis on Trump, shall we say. But more on that later. But they react hysterically to him, as they do to Corbyn, as they do to Brexit. And this is especially true of what I would call the intellectual layers of the American and British state systems. And for them, they cast around desperately looking for people to blame, and particularly for this layer of intellectuals, propagandists, media figures, intelligence men. They can't deal with the problems that generated the Trump turn or Brexit or even Corbyn. So what do? You have to create the man who wasn't there. You have to create the figure of Putin to pin all this on, because you are, again, subconsciously admitting that you can't solve any of these problems. If your only response to any particular issue is to say, well, that's a Putin talking point, then you don't have an argument. There is no argument to be made by them either for their actions or in defense of their system. If the only thing you can say is, oh, that's a Russian plot. Again, they haven't resorted so far to it's a Chinese plot. That's more of an American thing than a British thing. But the liberals in particular have gone so far down this road that they can't think outside of it. Other pieces of the puzzle here to slot in as we draw our comments on this particular issue to a close are that the hysteria, of course, doubles and then triples and then sextuples after 2014 to 15, when after having sat there and watched Yugoslavia get destroyed, and then Iraq get destroyed, and then Libya get destroyed, the Russians finally decided that if they let Syria slide, having been allied with the Assad government and the Syrian Baathists for a long time, back to the days of the Soviet Union, if they just let that get destroyed, not only would that have a deleterious effect upon Russian security, but also it would basically just allow the imperialists to keep on rolling towards them. They finally worked out that the plan that was in operation in West Asia wasn't just about Libya, it wasn't just about Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria. It was about securing a position for the imperialist powers that would enable them to exert military pressure upon Russia itself. Now, remember, we should go back to the Project for the New American Century documents, to the original Wolfowitz memorandum, to see that this was always the plan. It's not just to secure control of the oil that they're going into West Asia. That's a big part of it. Again, there's a strategic plan as well. And the strategic plan is to give yourself a military advantage vis-a-vis Russia and China by being able to surround them with military assets. The plan, of course, originally was they were going to get Iran as well. Bad luck on that one, lads. It didn't happen 20 years ago. It's certainly not going to happen now. So the paranoia and madness about Putin, the fictional figure of Putin, comes from real-world actions by the Russians, which is that the Russians started getting in the way. Having tried to appease Western imperialism for 20-plus years since the end of the Soviet Union, in fact, earlier. In fact, you could say that the appeasement of imperialism really began at least as early as 87 with Gorbachev. But having appeased for decades, they finally realized that there would be no appeasement, that they would be on the chopping block sooner rather than later, unless imperialism was stopped, which leads them to get involved in the Syrian war and ultimately be a part of the winning coalition in the Syrian war with the Iranians, Hezbollah, and the Syrian government. The US hasn't acknowledged its defeat yet, but it has been defeated. So the bitterness and the rage from that, of course, fuels the blame it all on Putin tendencies. And to a certain extent, you can see from their class's point of view why that's valid, because Putin had got in the way. Yeah, he is president when the Russians make a decision to intervene and to stop the proxy forces of the United States in Syria. So that war was meant to be the next domino falling. Again, remember, Obama is working off the same plan as George W. Bush, a plan that continued under Trump and continued in a failed form under Biden. It's all the same plan, going all the way back to the days of Bill Clinton. Same list of countries to work off, same target, with the same aims in mind. And so Putin getting in the way, it drives these people into a frenzy. They have convinced themselves, some of them at least, the less intelligent of them, that Putin is the one thing that has got in their way, that Putin is the demon, the puppet master who has got in the way of their glorious crusade in Syria and has to be removed at all costs. It probably made them redouble their efforts in stoking and fueling further the existing war in Ukraine after 2014, and it fueled the Russian decision to get involved in Syria, the fact that they'd been blatantly fucked over in Ukraine by the imperialists, and the imperialists clearly had a plan to destroy Ukraine if necessary in order to damage Russia. So to go back to the point, the question that was originally asked by the listener who sent this in, why blame the riots in Britain on Putin? Well, for all the reasons I've just gone through, but also because, to go back to the something I mentioned just a moment ago, they have no solution. They have no solution to these riots. They have no solution to the immigration question. They have no solution to the questions of long-term unemployment, poverty, alienation, immiseration. And they don't intend to have any solutions either, because their system created this. In terms of creation of racism, nothing creates more racism than the cultural and material forces unleashed by an imperialist power inside its own country. In terms of the reasons behind the riots that are real, racism and division is encouraged relentlessly by the British state, and has been, well, for as long as there's been a British state, to be honest. The overriding aim being, of course, the working class can never be allowed to unite. So if you're looking for villains, that's where the actual villains actually lie. Because it's the reason why they can never solve the issues that cause the riots, because their system creates all the problems quite deliberately in some cases. But again, you need somebody to blame it on who's going to be acceptable to the liberals, and so you blame it on Putin. You blame it on Putin because the ruling class absolutely cannot stop its endless work of sowing division in the working class. They cannot solve the immigration question because, again, they cannot ever stop mass importing of a large reserve army of labor, or I should say large amounts of labor that could be hyper exploited or added to the reserve army, or used as a means by which to threaten the pre-existing working class, and then keep that working class from dividing with the newer elements of from uniting, I should say, with the newer elements of the working class. Again, these aren't problems that the system is interested in solving. They're problems that the system is interested in creating and making worse. But you need a justification for all of this. You need somebody to pin it all on rather than address it honestly, which you cannot possibly do. Nothing in Britain today can be addressed honestly by the system. You can't address any serious issue in an honest way, because that would lead back to, ultimately, the power of big capital in this country, which lies behind much of the problems. And so you have to invent fictions for people to believe in, fairy stories for them to chase after. And so the Putin, the puppet master, is the fairy story that they have created, that they will pin everything on that is when an unpleasant reality intrudes, it must be Putin. Just as when an unpleasant reality intrudes in an obvious way, such as that nobody's watching their propaganda channels anymore, well, that must be Putin at work as well. He's drawn people into watching his Kremlin-sponsored memes because why wouldn't everybody who's under the age of 40 want to watch the BBC or ITN anymore? Again, they can't deal with the fact that their propaganda channels have drained in popularity. They can't deal with the fact that nobody wants to read their shite newspapers anymore. They can't deal with the fact that, even in a distorted way, more and more working class people have woken up in a basic sense to the fact that they're being served crap in the bourgeois press. They might not understand this in the right way yet. They might have all kinds of crazy explanations. Like, I remember going on these anti-lockdown marches during COVID, and my God, people had some funny ideas. But the thing that you had to credit them for was that suddenly thousands of ordinary people, regular workers, had at least looked at what was being told to them on the BBC and the other news networks and the newspapers and the radio, and they decided, because of their own experiences, that this was shite, that they were being lied to, and that they weren't going to listen to it anymore. Now, again, that's a good step in the right direction. So even though some of these people, maybe quite a lot of them, have gone down various different rabbit holes of propaganda, at least they've taken the first step, and it's that first step which the ruling class cannot tolerate at all. That first step of looking at the curated fake reality in the newspapers, TV, etc., or on the internet, and saying, I don't believe this. This isn't my experience. Well, that's something that the system can't stand, because if they start doing that, then there's no limit to the things that they could discover are fictions. So you better feed them some more fictions. You better, find some new ways to ensnare them back into propaganda networks. But as I said, a very important first step has been taken by a lot of individual workers now who've looked at the bourgeois press and have decided that they're not having it anymore. And that is another reason why they promote the vision of Putin, the villain, because it can't be that these millions upon millions of people in Britain or the US have looked at the bourgeois press and just think it's ridiculous and has nothing to do with the reality they live in, and so therefore have rejected it. No, it has to be Putin who is mind controlling them via memes, you know. Again, ridiculous, doesn't stand up to any examination, but he's not meant to be examined. So as long as you don't examine it and you just hysterically assert it in tiny circles, usually of, you know, liberals have their tiny circles where everything is repeated endlessly, and people who would call themselves conservatives or open reactionaries have their circles where holy truths, which are total bullshit, are repeated endlessly, and no one ever asks for them to be proved. So what we are facing is something which is new and also very old. What's very old is that the powers that be, the ruling class in any powerful country, especially one that's on the slide, as ours is, as the US is, have always needed a villain to blame everything on when they have no intention of solving and no ability to solve any of the fundamental problems which are facing them. That's the very old thing. The new thing is that the propaganda networks that they've relied upon and which have worked for them for so long are falling apart now and are being rejected, and they don't know what to do. So the only move they've got is to try and blame it all on misinformation emanating from the Kremlin. They cannot face the reality, which is that their narratives just don't stack up anymore. And so far easier to blame a convenient villain in the Kremlin than to actually address the problems. Because, again, imperialism has no intention of addressing any problems. The only interest the ruling classes really have, and this is something which even some bourgeois politicians are having to face now, is that they just want to keep on clipping their coupons for a few more years. That's all they want to do. Extract some more profit, extract some more surplus, shall we say, hyper exploit their some more resources, perhaps, or just keep the money flowing in for a few more years. That's the limit of their ambitions. And this is even starting to hit some bourgeois politicians who are suddenly realizing that they're facing a system which is incapable of being changed. Like, I think that even a character like J.D. Vance, who I have no time for, does realize on some level that they've got a really bad problem in the United States, which is that the problem is actually the ruling class themselves. And they want to do all this ambitious reindustrialization. And the problem is that the ruling class themselves won't invest. Now, because J.D. Vance is on the right, he can't process that properly, so he has to come up with fictions. It's the bureaucracy, it's the PMCs, it's the crazy cat ladies that are in the way. No, but the actual reality is that the biggest opponents, the biggest barrier to reindustrialization is the ruling class itself. It is the nature of US capitalism itself. And even J.D. Vance, on some level, is probably aware that that's a problem, but he'd rather have his own myths, which don't necessarily involve Putin. They largely involve China. We can speak more about that on another night, though. So I hope that gives some clarity to the situation. I'm now going to take in some comments from the floor. All right, going back up to the top. All right, so greetings to everybody who's tuned in. Just going to take some highlights here. So hello to Tobias, Jerry, BWP, Will Johnson, and Krasovets. Edward Leibniz, apologies if I've got your name wrong there, comrade, says, greetings. I don't like to personalize things, but after reading Valery Sablin's tragic 1975 naval rebellion story, he was the man who could have saved the USSR from the Comprador clique in 1990. I've heard that story before. You know what? I'm going to have to go back to that. So I'm going to highlight your comment, Edward, and come back to the Valery Sablin story another night. Paul Mason joins us from a cocktail party. Paul, please come on the show. I'm sure we could have an enlightening discussion. Greetings to Peter in Perfidious Albion and Banana Bender already in tomorrow. Roddy and yours truly are here, as is DE. Banana Bender asks, have you seen Trauma Zone by Adam Curtis? He briefly goes over Putin, says he was picked as a non-threatening bureaucrat. I haven't seen that Adam Curtis film, so I'm not going to comment on it. I mean, I find Curtis's approach to the Soviet Union and Russia very typical of like a bourgeois English liberal, though. So I might watch that and just do something on it, just because like Curtis is an interesting figure and his work is interesting to talk about. So thanks for highlighting it. Arnold, greetings to you. Colchester Ian, good evening. Yours truly says that they say Francis Walsingham was the first spy master. They do indeed, the man who invented the modern British intelligence service. So some credit Cromwell's spy master with that. I'll have to go back and perhaps do something on him. Tim Gray, good evening to you. Philippos Kasape says, you were saying that Russia will destroy Ukrainians. In a few days, we have to read the news from Russian sources with more skepticism as we do with Western news. If you're referencing the Kursk raid, I mean, I'll address this briefly. I don't have time to go into it much more today. Look, that Ukrainian raid, it will be disastrous for them in long term, even in the medium term. It's a short-term PR victory that has, if anything, worsened their position militarily and worsened their position politically. Now, has it lasted longer than many of us initially expected? Yes, I'll admit that. They were able to go far further and with more men than I expected. And so, yeah, fair play on that one. That was an error on my part. Now, as to the exact reality of why they got in as far as they did and what's happening to them now, that's another question. There are those who say that the whole thing was a lure to draw in Ukrainian troops into Russia itself to enable them to enable a lot of Ukraine's best men and equipment to be comprehensively destroyed. I don't know if that's the truth or not, but that's certainly what's happening. And it hasn't stopped the Russian advance in Donbass at all, nor has it caused the Russians to have to divert men away from that. They've been using men who were in the reserve, who were already inside Russia itself. So it hasn't stopped the Russian advance. It hasn't obtained any of the objectives that the Kiev regime actually wanted. And I will defend my analysis of the other day when I talked about this, because I said then that this was something that was being dictated from London and Washington, and it was being done basically to build up Zelensky's authority again and enable the war to be continued by saying, look, the Ukrainians can win, even though they haven't seized anything of real strategic importance. The bridges they've blown up have already been replaced by pontoon bridges the Russian Engineering Corps have already put up there to replace them. They haven't managed to seize the Kursk nuclear power plant. They've sacrificed thousands and thousands of men for, again, a PR and propaganda victory. So I reject the idea that you seem to be putting out there that this was some sort of great victory. It was a temporary tactical success and a medium to long-term strategic military and political disaster for them. Again, it hasn't disadvantaged the It's embarrassed. If it was the case that this was a fuck-up by the Russian MOD and the Russian High Command, then that embarrasses Gerasimov and the MOD and Belousov. It embarrasses the Kremlin. But ultimately, it gains Ukraine nothing. Just scrolling through here. Legal Advising says, greetings from Romania. Unfortunately, my country is now occupied by NATO soldiers and the anti-Russian propaganda is reaching the level of the Third Reich. Well, I would say that our brothers and sisters in the East need to, well, we all need to our country, the working classes of our countries to wake up. I would say also for the people of the East, these countries, the ex-people's democracies, have been asset stripped and destroyed and turned into what, potential cannon fodder by the American imperialists. Like, there needs to be a rebellion in all of these countries against these comprador scumbags who have run them into the ground over the last 30 years on a series of false promises, just like Ukraine as well. As what's happened there is similar in a more extreme way to what's happened in Romania, Bulgaria, etc. But all of these countries are being destroyed. So there needs to be a comprehensive flushing out of the bastards who have run them into the ground for 30 plus years. You can't do that on a capitalist basis, I don't think. The only thing that will save these countries is the revival of socialism. Greetings to you, Edward, and the historically great revolutionary Latvian proletariat. May they revive soon. Tim Gray says the art of propaganda isn't to make you think, but to sow confusion and entrench constructed stereotypes. It's why propaganda on social media is so effective. Good point. Going through. Hello to Irish Partisan, who's off at the local Minsk karaoke. Sing one for us, comrade. Going through the comments here. Good afternoon to Jenny and comrade Ian Foster. Greetings to both of you. Spirit in the Machine says Saakashvili, both Georgian president, then governor of Odessa, hard-working Western operative. Yes, there's a man with a big skill set. He's got the skill to run any place he's given charge of into the ground. I think when he was in Ukraine, he even tried to do a coup against Poroshenko. I mean, the guy's ambitious. You can't fault him for that. Shanika McAdams, good evening to you. Zain Mudassir, good evening to you. Mouse SF says, I keep a contraband copy of the Russian Standard Playbook in my kitchen because standing on it is the only way to reach a top cupboard. Good one. Gerardo says, is it going to be recorded or uploaded anywhere? This is being recorded on, we are live on YouTube and on Rumble. So we got Rumble working again, so you can go across there and see that. Jenny says Putin must get a huge kick out of listening to all this nonsense about himself and all the powerful puppet master and cartoon villain stuff. Yeah, I mean, I doubt he pays attention to it, to be honest. I mean, he shouldn't. I mean, one of the good things about recent years is that I think the Russians have finally stopped being, even the Russian bourgeois, some of them anyway, have even finally stopped being impressed by the West, which they should never have been impressed by them in the first place. Movie Maker Joe says, much like Yaxley Lennon, it's Barry Soetoro, not Obama. Both useful tools. Yes, indeed. Barry Soetoro is his real name. Barack Obama was his stage name. Hugh Keenan says, are NATO wars for the last 20 plus years connected to Putin's energy policies in Russia, or is this just a coincidence? It's partly to do with energy, to answer Hugh's question. The desire to get exclusive control over Russian energy resources is a big part of what motivates the imperialists. That's true. It's more than that, though. It's that again, it started with a basic reassertion of the control of the Russian state over its territory. They wanted to not just control the energy resources, but to break up. I think ultimately the plan was to break up Russia into several more manageable parts, because even if you get a complete comprador scumbag like, I don't know, Nicholas II or Boris Yeltsin in charge, there's always the risk that somebody more capable or a more capable system is going to emerge. And Russia's this country with enormous potential, as was realized to a degree under the Soviet system, particularly in the Stalin period. So the ideal plan for the West, for both China and Russia, remember, the historic plans of the West with regard to China was to keep a weak dynasty there, or then keep it broken up with various competing so-called warlord factions in the 1920s. And that's, by the way, what would have happened to China had the great heroes of, I'm saying that in heavy inverted commas there, of Tiananmen Square, had they succeeded in 1989, China would have suffered a fate probably worse than Russia. And Russia would thus have also suffered a fate worse than what it did. The ultimate Western plan was to break up both. Because, again, these are two big places that the American imperialists can't digest easily. So break them up. Break them up into... You could easily see what the plan is just by looking at American propaganda back in the 90s with China. Free Tibet, fuck the Beastie Boys and all that, and Richard Gere. Break Tibet away from China, break Xinjiang away from China, break various other different regions with different ethnic groups in them away, just as you were wanting to do in Russia. Do the same thing in Russia. And so rather than two big, potentially powerful states, you've got, I don't know, 50, just picking a number out of the air, very much smaller, less powerful states to deal with that you can manage quite easily. Just look at what they did in Yugoslavia. What they did in Yugoslavia was the model for what they wanted to do to Russia and what they wanted to do to China. Overthrow the current governments, break them up into 1,000 different pieces, exploit each of them much more easily, and routinely turn them against each other. Look at the wars they managed to trigger both inside the Central Asian states and between them in the 90s and 2000s. That's the fate that they wanted for Russia and China. Just going down. Songs 4K says, Liz Wall got so mad about RT at the US Senate hearings in 2015 because it aired dissenting Western voices. Yeah, that's the only reason they're really mad at it. Jenny says, the gaslighting has been so extreme that even the normies have started catching on. Their arrogance is out of control. That's very true, Jenny. Magnus Garkon says, why are you a communist? Communism has failed and has never succeeded anywhere. Well, I thank you, Mossad bot. I would say that you should go away and read the reports on the first 5-year plan and think about why Russia is able to sustain itself today. It sustains itself because of the victories of communism. Communism did not fail because of the weaknesses of Marxism. It failed because the men at the top of the Soviet Union collapsed because they turned to capitalism. That's why they failed. They turned to capitalism. They turned to bureaucratic rule, more and more bureaucratic rule, and they removed or tried to remove the working class from power by destroying the dictatorship of the proletariat. That's why the Soviet Union failed. In brief, I've got many videos on this. If you, Magnus, want to go back and watch them and come back with more questions, you're more than welcome to. I welcome your anti-communist tirades. So we've got two anti-communists saying the same thing. I'm gonna ban one of you because you're being unoriginal. Come back with an original comment. One of you, I'm presuming it's the same person, is still allowed to post. So come back, come back and post something original. Christopher Beckett says, have the ruling class ensnared workers back into propaganda with the Muslim scare? My cousins who were right about COVID lockdowns were completely on board conspiratorially with the riots. It's an interesting question, Christopher. I would say what this shows us is that the ruling class does have a flexible system of propaganda. And unless you have a comprehensive worldview, you're not able to deal with it. So like a worker can, like your cousins, work when something hits them in the face that's blatantly wrong, like COVID lockdowns or something like that they know is blatantly against their interests, they can work out the government's lying quite quickly. And that was a new thing as well. That was something that the government did suddenly, and they hadn't tried anything like that before. The Muslim propaganda thing, the anti-Muslim shit, that's been going on a lot longer. I mean, that's been going on like over half my life. And I can think of it, it was going on pre 9/11. So all of us, I mean, I don't know how old you are, have grown up in the shadow of this. So whereas the COVID thing was new, they tried various different sort of aggressive public health measures, never went as far as lockdowns, though. That was something that very much impinged upon people's personal lives and work lives in a very major way. And whereas the Muslim thing, the anti-Muslim shit is more passive. It doesn't, the anti-Muslim propaganda is able to be absorbed without being challenged because most people absorb it and don't think about it most of the time. All the anti-Muslim crap over the last 20 years. I mean, I've known people who will repeat all the shit that I'm sure that you've experienced from people, and many of the rest of us have in Britain and the United States. But at the same time, they work with Muslims and get on all right with them. There's amongst some people, there's this huge disconnect because, like, on the personal level, most people in Britain are not bitter racists. They're like, if they're working in a place with a bunch of people who are Muslim or people who are for various different faith groups, people who are not white, most of the time they'll rub along fine with them. But the figure of the Muslim, and I said this in a piece of writing I did recently, the figure of the Muslim has been made into a sort of stand-in for all like foreign evils, that and Putin, you know? And so with the anti-Muslim shit, what they've done is they've got people to identify the figure of the Muslim as being external to them and as something which is a sort of this shady not this shady conspiracy, much like the Putin stuff, which doesn't have any real connection to reality. Occasionally they'll throw in something that like is rooted in something that's real. So for instance, there are guys who are Muslim who are also rapists, just as there's an awful lot of guys who are white and nominally Christian who are rapists in this country. And they'll make a big thing out of that. But most of it remains on the level of like suggestion and rumor and building up of prejudice. It's not something which directly hits people in the face every single day. It's something which is meant to be passively received. And so to go back to your point, whereas with the riots, with COVID, again, that was something that was new, that they hadn't had time to soften people up about, but it wasn't going to work because it did hit so many ordinary people, ordinary workers in the face with an immediate restriction of their lives. Again, the Muslim thing, much easier to build up over a much longer period of time, and most of the time is able to be done passively. So when something like this emerges, all the prejudices, particularly when they can use an emotive issue, come to the surface all at once. And I would just on the COVID thing and and to compare it to the riots, I would say that the way to talk about some of this sometimes is to just say to people, look, if you're prepared to say and you've correctly analyzed, put it this way, if people have correctly analyzed that the entire media was lying to them about lockdowns, all of it, that the BBC was lying to them, that all the press was lying to them, that most of the politicians were, then why are they not lying to you constantly about everything else as well? Why is it that you think that the same people are telling the truth about about immigration, about what the role of the Muslim communities are in this country, about what they do, about who they are? And why is it that suddenly the people who would lie to you about an issue that was hitting you in the face in terms of COVID lockdowns you suddenly believe that they're telling you the truth about something else? Something which often doesn't hit you in the face every day. Why would they not lie to you about something which is actually more easy to lie to you about? Similar argument you can use about communism itself. Like if you as a worker can see that the politicians are going to lie to you about even what you're paying at a shop, they're going to lie to you and say that prices have gone down. They're going to lie to you and say that, oh, we've beaten inflation. They're going to lie to you and say that you're better off when you know you're not. So why would they not lie to you about a system which could threaten theirs? Why would they not lie to you about a country thousands of miles away whose language you don't speak, whose alphabet you probably don't understand, which you've never been to and likely never will? Why would they not lie to you about all of that? And also events that took place 80 years ago. Why would they not lie about all of that to you when that's much easier to lie about? It's a question of, for communists, it's a question of getting people to make connections between things, because you're not encouraged to do that. This is one of the other factors of propaganda. You're encouraged, as in the imperialist countries, you're encouraged to see everything as an individual issue. So what we've got to do is to encourage people to think more systematically, and that's our challenge. Okay, just scrolling down. Here, can't read out all the comments because I've got to knock off in just a moment, but greetings to Harold and President Jesus. Be sure to like and share and subscribe if you haven't done so already. I'm going to have to bring things to a close for this evening, and thank you to all 384 of you who are watching. I will be back again tomorrow at 4 p.m. for those of you who are in Britain, to do a slightly longer stream of a couple of hours, looking specifically at the wars in West Asia and Ukraine. So please join me for that one. But until then, thank you for tuning in. And thank you to everybody who supports the show on Patreon. On Patreon this week, we've got our Patreon exclusive release, which is the latest interview we've done with Kit Clarenberg about the Tel Aviv connection with the so-called patriots of the EDL, and how they're being essentially heavily influenced by the Israeli intelligence services. So be sure to head over to Patreon and listen to that one. And the audio version of this will be up on Patreon tomorrow. So thanks to everybody who supports the program. I'll be back with you again at 4 p.m. tomorrow.